1943, the North Atlantic. The sea was black as oil, heavy with smoke and death. Allied ships were vanishing without a trace, torpedoed by Hitler's U-boats that hunted in packs, unseen beneath the waves. Britain was bleeding ships faster than it could build them. The convoys, lifelines of food, weapons, and hope, were being ripped apart by an enemy no one could even see. But somewhere beneath that same cold ocean, a handful of British engineers and sailors were about to attempt the impossible, to strike back. Their weapon wasn't a battleship or a bomber. It was something smaller, stranger, a secret built in silence and steel, so unconventional that even their own navy doubted it would work. This is the story of the forgotten submarine that defied logic, rewrote the rules of naval warfare, and outsmarted the entire German Navy. A weapon so small it could sneak beneath history itself, driven not by power, but by the courage of ordinary men. By 1942, Britain was on the edge of collapse. The Atlantic was a graveyard. Every ship that sailed from America carried food, fuel, or ammunition, the blood that kept the Allied war machine alive. And yet, almost half never made it across. The German Navy's wolf packs, dozens of U-boats working in silent coordination, turned the sea into a killing ground. Sailors spoke in whispers of the steel sharks that waited under the waves. There was no warning, only the sudden scream of a torpedo and the fire that followed. The Admiralty knew it couldn't go on. Conventional submarines were too big, too loud, too predictable. They needed something that could slip through harbor defenses, move unseen beneath anti-sub nets, and strike the enemy where he felt safest, inside his own waters. It was a desperate idea born from desperate times. So in the damp workshops of Portsmouth, a small team of naval engineers began work on something radical: the X-Craft. Barely 50 feet long, manned by just 4 men, it was the smallest combat submarine ever built. It could crawl along the seabed, plant mines beneath enemy ships, and vanish before anyone noticed. But it was a nightmare to operate. The crew had almost no room to move, barely enough oxygen for a few hours, and had to endure crushing pressure, darkness, and silence. Every dive was a gamble between bravery and death. Most officers dismissed it as madness. A suicide coffin, one admiral called it. But among the young engineers, there was a stubborn faith that this tiny machine could do what fleets could not. One of them, Lieutenant Donald Cameron, wrote in his log, "If it works once, it will change everything." And then came the target, the German battleship Tirpitz, a 52,000-ton monster hidden deep in a Norwegian fjord, protected by mountains, minefields, and a web of steel nets. The ship was so powerful that its mere presence kept the entire British Navy on edge. Churchill called it the Beast. The Allies had bombed it, ambushed it, even sent spies to destroy it, but nothing worked. Until now. The plan was madness. 6 X-Craft would be towed across the North Sea, dive under the anti-submarine nets, sneak up beneath Tirpitz, and attach massive explosive charges onto her hull, all without being detected. If any were caught, there would be no escape. The Germans showed no mercy to saboteurs. Every man who volunteered knew what he was signing up for. And still, dozens did. As the men trained in silence, the engineers made final adjustments. Leaks sealed with tape, oxygen tanks double-checked, navigation charts studied until the lines blurred into dreams. They were not soldiers or heroes, just young men who believed in one impossible idea: that a handful of ordinary sailors could outwit the might of Hitler's Navy. When dawn came on September 11, 1943, the X-Craft were ready. Each was assigned a letter, X5, X6, X7, and towed into the endless gray sea. The water was calm, but the tension inside the hulls was suffocating. For hours they crept forward, engines humming like the pulse of a dying world. Beneath them lay darkness, pressure, and death. Ahead, Tirpitz. They moved through the sea like ghosts, towed in silence by larger submarines that swallowed the dark for them, each tiny hull a heartbeat under a blanket of cold water and thicker fear. Hours became a long blur of diesel cough, the metallic smell of oil, and the constant, intimate noise of men living 3 to a room. Boots scraping against steel, fingers whirring at straps, whispered checks of equipment that sounded unbearably loud inside the cramped capsule of the X-Craft. Outside, the ocean was flat and iron, the night a black sheet pulled taut across the world. Inside, the air tasted of sweat, cordite, and the salt the men couldn't stop breathing. They had trained for this until muscle memory erased the tremor from their hands. But training had not taught them the way time expands when you know the cost of one mistake. A single leak, a single failed seal, and the cold would bite through every plan and promise. The tow lines thumped like distant artillery as the mother submarines dragged their charges toward the Norwegian coast, threading the Arctic's bight with a patience that felt like prayer. Every man stared at the bulkhead as if the metal could give him courage. Every watch was a countdown, every cheap clock a conspirator. When the signal finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. A soft, precise series of taps through the hull, and the world narrowed to one motion. Release. The tow cable slackened, there was a dull shudder as the mother submarine slid away, and the midget craft floated free into the black. For a moment they simply bobbed, small islands in an immense, uncaring sea, engines whispering under the roar of their own pulses. Then they dove. Water closed over them like a lid. Light thinned, pressure pressed in, not just on metal, but on the soul. The hull creaked in tones that sounded, to men who had never before been so compressed, like the groan of a giant settling its weight. Instruments became their lifelines. Depth gauges, compasses, a tiny periscope that offered a sliver of a world they were leaving behind. The noise of the ocean was both friend and enemy. The slap of waves miles above disguised their approach, but it also masked the subtle clues of danger. An echo that suggested an anchor cable, a faint metallic ping that might be the sweep of an anti-subnet. Each sound had to be read and interpreted. Every small vibration could mean detection or doom. They were trained to move slowly, to think of the sea not as a space to cross, but as a maze to be felt. The X-craft crawled along the seabed when required, skimming under kelp and around boulders, treading the sand like a spider. The men learned to sense the ocean's moods, the slight rise of current that would take them past a minefield, the taste of brine that meant they were closer to fjord mouthwater, warmed by trapped daylight. Navigation at that depth was primitive and absolute. Charts folded and refolded under lantern light, a navigator tracing a line with a finger, then tracing it again with the tip of his pencil until the land looked like a foreign map from a distant dream. Above them, the fjord's walls closed. Mountains that swallowed sound and hid the ship they sought in a pocket of gray. The Tirpitz sat there like a colossus in its private cathedral, steel black against the birch and snow, guns that could slice convoys in two, a fortress that made men speak in smaller voices. Around her, nets and booms dangled like the teeth of a trap. Mines bobbed and bobbed, some more like sinister buoys. Patrol craft made regular circuits, ripples of radar and searchlight that could tear invisibility into shreds. Every inch closer felt like walking a razor's edge. When one of the midget submarines first met a net, the world contracted to two things: the crunch of metal and the ballet of hands. For a breathless minute, the crew fought to hold position, feeling the strain in the hull, listening for that small, distinct sound that meant their cables were snagged. The men worked with the silence of surgeons, ropes cut, floats released, the X-craft pivoting with a care that belied the violence of what must be done. Each man's knuckles were raw from gripping corroded metal. Each man's mouth was a tight line because there was no space for panic. They had rehearsed for every mechanical failure, but rehearsal never quite prepared them for the human response when all the air in the world seems to take on a different weight. In one hull, a valve stubbornly refused to close, and the gurgle of incoming water announced itself like a sentence. For a few seconds, the men felt the cold edge of inevitability. A rise in pressure, a rattle as the pumps fought, the bitter knowledge that time was fracturing around them. Yet even then, there was resourcefulness. A wedge of rubber used where no rubber should have remained, a hand jammed tight against a leak while the other man worked a wrench in the dark. At first, there was only silence. The fjord was still, the water calm as glass, broken only by the faint echo of gulls and the distant hum of engines aboard the Tirpitz. To the German sailors above, the world seemed unchanged. Another routine morning in their hidden fortress of steel. But below the surface, time itself was ticking. Deep beneath the great battleship, the British charges, two massive mines weighing nearly 2 tons each, rested like sleeping giants under her belly. They had been set for a precise moment, synchronized by the trembling hands of men who would never live to see the result. As dawn faded into a pale Arctic morning, the clock began to reach its end. The crews of the X-craft, captured and battered, were already ashore under heavy guard. Some had been pulled from the wreckage half-drowned, their eyes wide from shock and exhaustion. They said nothing. None of them dared reveal what lay beneath the sea. The Germans interrogated them harshly, convinced that these strange miniature submarines had been spies or saboteurs, but even the interrogators could not imagine what was coming. Then, at 8:12 a.m., the fjord erupted. The blast was not a single explosion, but a convulsion of the earth itself. The Tirpitz, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, Hitler's invincible sea monster, lifted violently out of the water as if struck by the hand of God. Steel plates buckled, gun barrels twisted, and massive holes tore through her armored belly. The sound roared through the fjord, bounced off the mountains, and shattered windows miles away. German sailors were thrown from their bunks, others crushed beneath collapsing decks. Oil tanks burst, flames rolled across the water, and black smoke rose in a column so thick it blotted out the sun. When the noise faded, the great ship still floated, but she was broken. Her rudders jammed, her engines crippled, her hull twisted beyond repair. The explosion had torn open the myth of invincibility that the Tirpitz had carried like armor. Word spread like fire through the Allied world. At first, even London didn't believe it. Reports were sketchy, something about a raid, a small submarine attack, an explosion under the Tirpitz. But when reconnaissance photographs arrived days later, the truth was undeniable. The ship, once Hitler's floating fortress, was listing heavily and dead in the water. Churchill's private note to the Admiralty was simple and coldly triumphant. "Well done. The beast is wounded." For the British Navy, it was more than a victory, it was a vindication. A handful of men armed with nothing but courage and the strangest submarines ever built had achieved what fleets and air raids could not. They had reached into the heart of Germany's naval pride and shattered it from beneath. For the men who carried out the mission, the moment of triumph came too late to feel like glory. Lieutenant Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Basil Place, the two surviving commanders who successfully planted their charges, were captured and imprisoned in freezing cells, hearing distant explosions without knowing their cause. When German officers told them of the damage to the Tirpitz, some refused to believe it. Others, silent, simply bowed their heads and wept, not out of joy, but relief that their comrades' sacrifice had not been in vain. They had gone to war inside machines no bigger than a truck and come back from hell having crippled a monster. The aftermath was brutal. The Germans reacted with fury, dragging the surviving X-craft crewmen through interrogation and confinement, though even their captors could not hide a grim respect. The Tirpitz was towed away for repairs, but she would never fully recover. Her engines were beyond saving, her steering system shattered, and her role in the war effectively over. She would sit uselessly in Norwegian fjords for the next year, a symbol of failure disguised as strength, until Allied bombers finally finished what the X-craft had begun. Back in Britain, the story emerged slowly, filtered through secrecy and censorship. The Royal Navy couldn't risk revealing the full details of its new weapon. Families received letters that began with the cold language of official gratitude. "Your son has been reported missing in action. His service was of the highest value to his country." Only later did the truth emerge, and the names of those who piloted the X-craft became legend among those who understood what true courage looked like. Cameron and Place were awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire, for their bravery. Posthumous mentions followed for the others who never returned. But medals and ceremonies could never capture what those men had endured inside those steel coffins under the sea. In the years that followed, engineers studied the wreckage of the Tirpitz and realized how precisely the X-craft attack had been planned. When the blast had faded and the sea fell silent again, the aftermath unfolded with a kind of dreadful calm. Smoke curled across the fjord, drifting through the birch-covered slopes like a funeral shroud. On the decks of the crippled Tirpitz, Men staggered through twisted metal and pools of oil, coughing in the acrid air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The once invincible battleship was no longer a weapon. It was a wounded beast. Beneath the decks, compartments were flooded. Lights flickered and waned as engineers stumbled through knee-deep water to seal bulkheads. The smell of fuel and burning insulation clung to every surface. Above them, the mountains swallowed the sound of human voices, muffling the shouts and orders into a low, broken rhythm that echoed back like ghosts. Some sailors were still trapped below, pounding on the steel that had become their tomb. Rescue teams worked frantically, cutting through metal that resisted even as time ran out. Those who survived would later speak of the eerie silence that followed the explosion, a silence filled not with peace, but with the realization that the unthinkable had happened. The Tirpitz, pride of the Reich, was crippled not by fleets or bombers, but by men and vessels so small the German Navy hadn't even considered them possible. For the crews of the X-craft, those who had survived the attack and now sat behind barbed wire, news of the explosion filtered in slowly, carried by rumor and guarded smiles from sympathetic guards. They were exhausted, bruised, and hungry. Some had spent days in isolation, questioned by German officers who couldn't fathom how such small machines had reached their ship. "You mean to tell me," one interrogator reportedly scoffed, "that 4 men in a tin can did this?" The British sailors said nothing. They had been trained for silence, and besides, there was nothing left to say. What mattered was done. In those cramped cells, in the dim light of captivity, they found something more enduring than fear. Pride. Pride that they had done their duty. Pride that the monster in the fjord was no longer untouchable. In London, the Admiralty received confirmation through intercepted communications, German distress signals, coded but unmistakable. Tirpitz had suffered catastrophic damage. There was cheering in the war rooms, but the mood quickly shifted to a quieter reverence. The operation had been secret even to many inside the Navy, and now it had succeeded at a cost that only those who planned it could fully comprehend. Officers studied the reports of the attack in silence, tracing the path of each X-craft across the sea like a finger over a scar. 5 of the 6 had never returned. Some were presumed sunk in the cold depths of the North Sea. Others were confirmed captured. The photographs of the men, young, serious, their faces barely past boyhood, were pinned to a board under the heading Operation Source. No speeches, no fanfare. Just names, ranks, and the quiet acknowledgement that these men had changed the war. Outside of military circles, no one knew what had happened. The newspapers printed vague headlines about an attack on a German battleship, without details. The families waited in silence. Wives clutched letters written before departure, some dated weeks earlier, words of love and reassurance written by men who already suspected they might not come home. Mothers stared at official telegrams that arrived with the chill of finality, missing in action. And yet, even in grief, there was a kind of pride that the truth could not hide. They didn't know how, but they sensed their sons had done something extraordinary. Months later, when the secrecy lifted, the story began to spread. The British public learned of the X-craft, of the impossible mission, of the bravery that bordered on madness. The idea of these miniature submarines captured the imagination of a nation weary of war. Newspapers called them the David of the Deep, and the phrase stuck on. It was poetic, but it also spoke to something deeper in the human heart. The belief that smallness does not mean weakness, that ingenuity and courage can tilt the scales of fate. The surviving officers, Cameron, Place, and their crews were honored in quiet ceremonies, their medals pinned in front of assembled sailors who understood better than anyone what it meant to dive into the unknown. The king himself remarked that the operation would forever stand as an example of British daring and discipline. But for the men who received the medals, the applause was hollow. They thought of their comrades still lying in the cold Black Sea, the ones who never surfaced, whose final moments were spent in darkness, with only the hum of machinery and the sound of their own breath for company. Meanwhile, the Germans tried to repair the Tirpitz, but she was never the same. Her engines, though patched, could not sustain full power. The years after the attack did not quiet the echoes of that explosion. They only deepened them. History, like the sea, has a way of swallowing men whole and smoothing their stories into silence, but some tales refuse to sink. In the cold archives of naval intelligence and in the letters of survivors, the legend of the forgotten submarine began to take shape, not as propaganda, but as a memory preserved in salt and blood. What those men accomplished became a symbol of a turning tide, proof that intellect and courage could achieve what raw firepower could not. Yet for those who lived it, heroism was never the word they used. They called it endurance. They called it duty, and they carried it quietly like a scar beneath a uniform. Lieutenant Donald Cameron spent his post-war years in relative obscurity, teaching younger officers about the lessons the sea never forgets. He rarely spoke of Operation Source except to describe how fragile success can be, how one misjudged current, one faulty valve, could have erased the entire mission. When asked later why he had volunteered, he simply said, "Someone had to prove it could be done." That sentence, simple and unadorned, captured the spirit of the entire operation. These were not men driven by fame or orders. They were driven by belief. Belief that the impossible, when faced with clear eyes and steady hands, could be made real. Basil Place, his counterpart and fellow survivor, later echoed the same thought. He described the cramped space of the X-craft as the loneliest place in the world and the most human. For him, every twist of the periscope, every sound of the sea scraping against steel, was a reminder that courage isn't loud. It breathes quietly, in darkness, under pressure. But the story of the X-craft was not only a military one, it was also a story of invention. The engineers who designed those submarines worked in sheds that leaked rainwater, using parts scavenged from failed prototypes in civilian factories. They were told the idea was too ridiculous to be funded, that no sane Navy would send men into battle inside machines that could barely fit their bodies. Yet they built them anyway, using ingenuity as their armor. When the mission succeeded, it redefined the limits of engineering courage. The blueprint for modern mini-subs, rescue vehicles, and stealth operations all trace their lineage to that improbable idea forged in wartime desperation. The X-craft was not just a weapon, it was a seed of a future where imagination became strategy. Still, for every line in the history books, there were moments lost to the sea, moments of fear that no report could capture. Men pressing their hands against cold bulkheads as depth charges exploded nearby, whispering prayers that dissolved into the hiss of leaking air. The sting of sweat in their eyes as they struggled with wrenches and gauges that refused to obey. The silence after the explosion, when they realized that the sea around them had turned to debris and fire. These details lived on only in fragments of diaries and in the memories of those who never forgot the sound of steel under pressure. For them, war was not glory, it was noise, darkness, and the relentless question of whether you would see the next sunrise. When the war ended, most of the X-craft were scrapped, their metal melted and recycled into peacetime machinery. But one or two were preserved, polished, and displayed in naval museums as relics of a time when courage came in cramped compartments and smelled of diesel and salt. Visitors still walk through those narrow interiors, marveling at how men endured such conditions. The silence inside those displays is almost reverent. The air feels heavy, as if the walls remember the breath of those who once called them home. Each dial, each lever, is a frozen echo of that impossible mission. A reminder that history's greatest acts are often performed by those who never sought recognition. In Norway, the wreck of the Tirpitz remains a graveyard and a monument. Divers who descend to its remains describe it as both haunting and peaceful. The giant ship resting on its side, her hull torn open like a wound that never closed. Schools of fish swim through the corridors where sailors once marched. Coral blooms on rusted cannons that never fired again. It is a cathedral of silence beneath the Arctic water, a reminder of how pride can sink and how human will can rise above it. Each year, ceremonies are held to honor the dead on both sides because Submarine, in its quiet mercy, has turned enemies into shared history. And yet, beyond the politics and the iron in the history books, something more enduring remains. The story of the forgotten submarine is not just about war, it's about the raw, unyielding force of human invention and resolve. It's about the small group of men who entered the unknown, not with certainty, but with the knowledge that courage means moving forward even when fear fills the air around you. Time has a way of sanding the sharp edges of history, but some stories resist erosion. The tale of the forgotten submarine lives on, not because it glorifies war, but because it reveals something elemental about the human spirit, the quiet defiance of ordinary people standing against impossibility. Decades after that September morning in 1943, the men who built and manned the X-craft became ghosts in their own lifetime. The world moved on. New wars, new technologies, new generations that would never know the smell of oil and salt that clung to those narrow steel tubes. Yet within the Royal Navy's archives and the memories of the old sailors who survived, the legend persisted like a current beneath calm water. To them, the X-craft was never just a weapon. It was proof that courage and ingenuity could meet on equal terms, that human will could bend even the laws of the sea. The story, when retold, carried with it the rhythm of a heartbeat under pressure, the rhythm of men who had once stared into the dark and refused to look away. As the post-war decades unfolded, the world discovered that innovation in warfare often springs from desperation. The submarine attack on the Tirpitz had inspired a new philosophy of combat: small teams, surgical precision, intelligence over firepower. The echoes of those principles could be found in Cold War espionage missions, in underwater recovery operations, even in the modern stealth submarines that glide through oceans today. Every sonar ping, every whisper of propulsion beneath the sea traces its ancestry back to those first men who dared to challenge the depths. Engineers studying modern submersible design still speak of the X-craft with reverence, as if they were not machines but the seeds of an idea that refused to die. Their very shape, a testament to human necessity, remains a symbol of minimalism and purpose. In a world that now prizes automation and artificial intelligence, it's easy to forget that the first real miracle of underwater precision was achieved by men who relied on nothing but dials, muscle, and faith. For the families left behind, the decades offered both closure and longing. Some received medals posthumously, delivered in plain envelopes that smelled of dust and bureaucracy. Others received only silence. There were mothers who never knew exactly where their sons had died, wives who never learned that the final words of their husbands had been written on scraps of oil-stained paper and hidden in the corners of those steel coffins. "Tell them it was worth it," one note read. That line, recovered years later from a preserved logbook, became the epitaph of the X-craft mission. Worth it, not because it won the war in a single stroke, but because it proved that even when the world seemed lost to tyranny, the smallest act of courage could shift the balance. In the 1960s and 70s, filmmakers and historians began to rediscover the operation. Documentaries narrated in somber tones revisited the fjords of Norway, showing viewers the rusted remains of the Tirpitz under shimmering water. Veterans, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, recounted their memories with a restraint that said more than any special effects ever could. They spoke of fear without shame, of exhaustion without bitterness. One of them, when asked what courage meant, simply replied, "Courage is what you do when the door closes and you have no choice but to go deeper." That single sentence summed up everything about the mission: the claustrophobia, the resolve, the quiet endurance of men who descended into the black knowing they might never rise again. In time, school children across Britain and Norway learned of the attack in textbooks and naval museums. The X-craft became a chapter heading, its story reduced to dates, tonnage, and technical specifications. But those who understood, the divers, the historians, the families, knew that the numbers were only shadows of what truly mattered. The human element, the trembling hands, the muffled prayers, the sheer defiance of death. That was the heartbeat of the story. It wasn't a tale of machines. It was a testament to humanity's refusal to surrender to the vastness of the world. The sea, after all, is not kind. It erases mistakes with the same patience that it erases heroes. Yet somehow the memory of the X-craft endured, cutting through that indifference like a beacon under waves. In the modern age, when war has become digital and distant, the courage of those men feels almost alien. Today, machines make decisions in milliseconds, satellites map the oceans, and drones fight wars from thousands of miles away. Yet there's something timeless about the image of four men in a steel capsule, steering by hand, fighting for breath and balance. Their fate sealed not by algorithms, but by the strength of their will. Years rolled onward, and what had once been the heartbeat of war faded into the measured silence of memory. The world rebuilt itself with concrete and diplomacy. But beneath the surface of progress, the ghosts of that forgotten submarine still stirred in the collective conscience of those who understood what had been risked and what had been won. The attack on the Tirpitz was no longer front-page news, no longer a weapon of morale or propaganda. It had become something purer, a parable whispered across generations, a story about what humans become when there is no way forward except through fear. For decades, the fjords of Norway stood like silent witnesses, holding in their still waters the echoes of explosions that had once shaken the earth. Each winter, the surface froze into glass, trapping the memory of that moment beneath a layer of quiet dignity. And when spring came and the ice broke apart, it was as if the sea itself was breathing again, breathing the memory of those men who had once dared to descend into its depths. By the late 20th century, a new generation of sailors and engineers began to look back at the X-craft, not merely as relics, but as teachers. They saw in those machines a reflection of their own struggles, not in war, but in the pursuit of mastery against chaos. Young naval officers studying submarine warfare would walk through the preserved hulls in museums and feel a strange mixture of awe and humility. Here, they realized, was the origin of everything they knew: the courage to confront uncertainty with calculation, the discipline to endure fear without surrender. The X-craft's cramped quarters, rusted valves, and handwritten dials became more than artifacts. They were a language of bravery carved into steel, a record of what human beings could accomplish when they refused to bow to circumstance. In 1993, 50 years after the mission, a small ceremony was held on the shores of Norway, where veterans from both sides, British and German, stood together. The air was cold and clear, the kind that stings the lungs but sharpens the mind. The surviving X-craft men were old now, their hair white, their movements careful, their eyes still carrying the same steady glint that once stared through periscopes in black water. They stood before a memorial stone inscribed with names, and as the naval choir sang, their faces revealed the weight of what they had carried for half a century. One of them, when asked by a journalist how it felt to return to the fjord, simply said, "We left something of ourselves down there." It never came back up. His words hung in the air like mist, part confession, part benediction. Even the German sailors who attended bowed their heads in respect, for they too understood what it meant to live under the shadow of the sea's mercy. In that moment, there were no victors and no vanquished, only survivors bound by a shared language of endurance. The ceremony was small, almost private, but it captured something larger than any history book ever could. The quiet reconciliation between men who had once tried to destroy each other, united now by the knowledge of what it means to risk everything for a belief. War, they knew, was not about hatred. It was about the collision of conviction and necessity, about the thin line between courage and tragedy. Standing beside that still water, the veterans looked across the fjord and saw not the place of battle but the reflection of time itself, vast, indifferent, and yet somehow sacred. In the years that followed, the memory of the forgotten submarine began to inspire people far beyond the military. Filmmakers, artists, and writers drew from its imagery the suffocating darkness, the tension between human fragility and mechanical endurance. The story became a metaphor for innovation, for persistence under pressure, for the quiet kind of heroism that does not shout, but hums steadily beneath the noise of history. In classrooms and leadership seminars, instructors quoted from the logs of the X-craft crews to teach lessons about calmness under stress and the discipline to face the unknown. The operation's name, once buried under layers of classified secrecy, became shorthand for the idea that even the smallest effort, executed with conviction, can tip the balance of history. Yet, for all its retellings, the story never lost its ache, because beneath the triumph lay something deeper, a sorrow that courage often demands the ultimate price. The men of the X-craft did not survive unscathed. Many carried the war within them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares of collapsing hulls, sudden flashes of darkness, the sound of water rising faster than breath. Their heroism was not cinematic. It was quiet, painful, and profoundly human. Some never spoke of it again. Others could not stop reliving it.